From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They call me Ben. We're joined as always with our super producer, Paul Mission Control Deckens. Most importantly, you are here, and that makes this stuff they don't want you to know. This is part 2 of our episode on the breach of the U.S. Capitol in the course of the attempted coup that occurred on January 6th, 2021. Here are the facts. As we mentioned in our previous episode, we've been exploring the facts of the matter as they occur at the time, from the rally to the blow-by-blow of the invasion, the evacuation. We do hope that you have listened to the first part of that episode. As we alluded to at the end of part 1 of that episode, this part of the episode is also being recorded on January 7th. We are entering the realm of some speculation. We're trying our best to stick with things that have been proven. However, we do want to issue the disclaimer that some of the things we discussed today may be answered between the time we record this episode and the time it publishes on Monday. That's right, folks. This is a full episode coming to you on Monday. We will air a strange news segment later in the week, so hold tight for that. As a matter of fact, hold tight in general, because things are getting very murky very quickly. Here's where it gets crazy. Chaos, gentlemen. Chaos and fatalities. We raised a point earlier about why we have made the decision not to refer to this group of insurrectionists as protesters. I think we can agree there is a hell of a difference between smashing the window of a Starbucks and invading a nation's capital while Congress is in session in hopes of subverting democracy, or, as the supporters of these acts would argue, attempting to save democracy, I guess. Either way you slice it, fatalities occurred. Fatalities are always going to be a tragedy. Whether or not you agree with the person, whether or not you agree with their actions that led to their demise. At 4 p.m. on January 6, 2021, a woman was shot as the mob stormed the Capitol, scaling walls, breaking windows to gain entry. A San Diego resident named Ashley Babbitt was shot in the chest by law enforcement as she attempted to enter the building through one of the broken windows. She did not die immediately. She was given medical attention, but did unfortunately pass away. We know a little bit more about her as the news emerged, but for a long time she was simply acknowledged as the unidentified first injury and then the first fatality. Later reports cite 3 more fatalities from what was originally described just vaguely as medical conditions. We do have the answers on those now. I will go ahead and give it to you. The reports say that one of the fatalities was a heart attack in reaction to a flashbang grenade. The second fatality was a fall, a 30-foot fall off scaffolding from the Capitol building. And then the third fatality, individual carrying a taser accidentally tased himself and as a result had a fatal heart attack.
It's easy to snicker at that one a little bit, but like you said, every death is a tragedy. And that scaffolding would have been those scaffolding on either side in the lawn that were set up for the inauguration coming up, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, we should mention also, I don't think we got to it in the first part of this series, but there were other things erected by the mob, such as a gallows, which is a very loaded symbol, but a gallows was erected with people in the crowd chanting that they were going to hang Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House. Then I believe a large cross was erected. I do not know at this point whether it was set aflame.
It's also worth mentioning, too, that just a few days prior, there were, I don't know, let's call them attacks, I guess, or at the very least, acts of intimidation on both Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell's private residences. The Nancy Pelosi one is particularly disturbing because it says, what does it say? Sack, cancel, rent, we want everything. And then there is a severed pig's head with blood strewn everywhere. And this is right in front of her garage in San Francisco.
And Mitch McConnell vandalism at his performative home in Kentucky, and I'll tell you why I think that's performative, that vandalism, I think, was related to the divisive proposal to provide additional COVID relief for people who are suffering through unemployment and obviously enormous medical bills, as happens anytime someone has an illness in the United States. I say performative because, and this is not just a ding on McConnell, this is common with a lot of lawmakers, you have to have a legal residency in the state that you represent or purport to represent. But from what I understand, at least, I don't want to speak for everybody, but what I understand, at least, McConnell spends the vast majority of his time at his D.C. residence because, like many members of Congress, there are times where he needs to spend most of his time in D.C. So odds are he was not at the home or at the structure in Kentucky when it was vandalized.
And really quickly, also just to say, what I was thinking when you said performative, in addition to that, was it's not a small house, but it's not a monolithic mansion either. So it gives sort of the impression of like, I'm one of you, I'm one of the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point, Noel. And of course, this is just based on what we see with a lot of politicians. If there's proof that McConnell spends the majority of his time at the Kentucky residence, then of course that's the fact of the matter. But from what we understand now, that is not the case, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because when you are in the halls of power like this, you do need to be on the scene pretty frequently. We mentioned a little bit of reaction from the officials, from the politicians. You may recall that President-elect Joe Biden took to stage first before current President Donald Trump and called for civility, of course, called for end to violence, said this is not what America represents, and then specifically called on President Trump to make a statement. At 4:15, January 6th, Donald Trump released a statement. It was taped, not live. He repeated his belief that the election was stolen, and he is convinced, in his opinion, the truth will out. And then he told the insurrectionist, quote, "We love you. You are very special," following up with, "I understand where you're coming from," essentially, I'm paraphrasing there, and then told them to go home. I do want to point out my initial reaction on Twitter there, just because I suspected that taped statement might be taken down off of the platforms he was using at the time, was to quote that specifically. And I said, "We love you. You are very special. Donald Trump to domestic terrorists, January 6th, 2021. That's on my personal Twitter. That is not representative of the views of our network necessarily. That's at Ben Bolin, HSW on Twitter.
It's a great account to follow. I also would add this ties right back into his primary focus on loyalty above all. He's hanging on to this contingent. This is kind of all he has left. This is his last ditch effort here, and he is appealing to that sense of loyalty. I love you. I feel your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it. Front loading it with that, and then ending it with, but go home. Like, I'm into what you're doing. I support what you're doing because what you're doing supports me, but stop or don't. That's the vibe that I got.
And Matt, to your earlier point about the use of language, the nuanced use of language here, there is an explicit statement in this taped recording, and in this statement, he explicitly says, "We don't want anybody hurt." What do you think about the language of that statement, Matt?
To me, it's all a deflection. The statement and this entire thing where earlier in the day he made statements that we discussed in the last episode about how we have to fight and fight really hard, and we have to essentially prevent this from happening and do everything we can to prevent it from happening, and then to say, look, you guys tried, but let's all be peaceful and go home. It's all a deflection off of himself, is what it feels like to me. And I know some people would take issue with that, but it feels very much like that to me.
Yeah. And at around 5 p.m., so about 45 minutes after this statement is disseminated, officers on the scene do deploy flashbang grenades and the tear gas we mentioned earlier in an attempt to clear remaining members of the mob from specifically the west side of the Capitol before that 6 p.m. curfew hits. Now, I may have pickled some cucumbers or ruffled some feathers with the phrase domestic terrorism. It's not an attempt to be hyperbolic. It's not an attempt to be alarmist. Here is why I use that phrase quite deliberately, because at least 2 IEDs, improvised explosive devices, were found. The street name for these would be pipe bombs. And they weren't just targeting, the ostensible political opponents of Donald Trump. There was one pipe bomb at the local RNC office. There was another one at the local DNC office. There was also more stuff found, but this was on the actual grounds of the Capitol.
Yeah, there was also a long gun found and a cooler full of Molotov cocktails on the Capitol grounds. A long gun it's not quite a sniper rifle. It's something along those lines. It's a long range weapon, right?
It could be any rifle, but really it wasn't defined in the moment there.
Got it.
Which means that the specific make has yet to be released or publicly identified. You know what I mean? And I wouldn't be surprised if there's an investigation into, chain of ownership for that, fingerprints, things of that nature. But at this point in the story, we are post-breach, as the news has taken to calling it, post-invasion, as some others have called it. The insurrectionist mob has occupied the Capitol for a number of hours, about 5 hours, I believe. Does that sound about right, guys?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So about 5 hours, they're roaming freely through the offices of Congress. And here again, we can see numerous photographs. The phrase we use often in the South is telling on themselves. We can see photos from the insurrectionists as they shout from the floor of the House or the Senate, saying things like, Donald Trump won this election. You can see one guy's got his feet propped up, I guess is the word, in the office of Nancy Pelosi. They are earlier, as we mentioned, they were taking selfies with some members of law enforcement. They were also posting videos, social streams, photographs on social media, left and right. Many of these people were not attempting to disguise themselves, neither their faces nor their voices nor mannerisms.
And let's not forget that none of them are wearing masks during a global pandemic. I just wanted to point that out. Not wearing masks to shield their identity, or for the maybe more practical reason of, to protect themselves and others from COVID. And another popular rallying cry was, "This is our house. This is our house." Because the Capitol is referred to as the people's house, and that's a reference to that. And they're like, "We're taking it back. This is our house."
Mm-hmm. And several individuals in this group are self-identifying, self-describing as revolutionaries, not protesters. Again, there's a reason. There are reasons that we were being very specific with the terms here. You can absolutely protest. You can absolutely disagree. As a matter of fact, I would say it is American to do so. We have hundreds of years of precedents on why dissent in some way is important and crucial to the health of the nation, but this is not the same thing. You can see images of this mob roaming door to door, shouting, quote, Where the are they? Who do you think they're talking about? You know what I mean? I'm pretty sure they're talking about members of Congress. And then as more photos come out, people start delving in. We see particular things that make this look less and less like some attempt at a peaceful occupation. There is an individual who appears to be armed, carrying zip ties. This is strong circumstantial evidence that at least some factions of these groups intended to either physically harm or physically take possession of members of Congress or their associated staff members. I don't know. Do you guys think I'm reading tea leaves there?
Nope.
That's what I think the zip ties are for.
I think so, yeah.
I think you can say at least one individual was planning on doing something like that or had that crazy idea.
Another thing I saw quite a lot of were baseball bats and just kind of bludgeon-y type weapons, Mob 101. Like, surprised there weren't pitchforks.
I think we just, I agree with everything you guys are saying. I think we just have to keep in mind that there's a percentage of people who were there who I think you could describe as insurrectionists. There's also a group of people there. I don't know how many. There's no way for us to know. Mm-hmm. But a group of people there that were just caught up in that mob mentality after going to that rally and getting all riled up. Mm-hmm. and having some similar feelings that are of connection to either the president or whatever ideologically is being fought for, that are just, they happen to be there and they happen to continue, and now they've found themselves inside the Capitol. I think we just have to say that. Yeah,
I hope I did a good job establishing that in part one as well. But you're right, we do have to say that. And the one thing I would note, the one reason I'm saying factions or individuals, Matt, rather than simply one person with zip ties, is because if you look at the forums in the time leading up to this, again, premeditated event, we see people writing, here's our plan, here's what we're going to do. Are they just being internet tough guys? Were all those messages from that one guy? I don't know. Only one person is shown with zip ties, though. It's a very fair point.
Agreed. And I can only imagine the moment of realization some of those lesser problematic elements felt when they realized how in over their heads they were and how they took it too far. And now they're getting swept up in something they maybe weren't fully prepared to be a part of.
That's true. I mean, think about this too. If you look through the photographs, you see people who do not appear as if they came to the Capitol with the express aim of doing violence to anyone. You see quite elderly people. I think, did you guys see those photographs as well?
I haven't seen those.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can go on live. This is one of the best times to use the service LiveLeak. If you go on LiveLeak, you can watch videos. There's one of a Capitol police officer attempting to prevent a bunch of people from coming up some steps and then getting into another vestibule area. And he's got his baton out and, saying, get back, get back, get back, and attempting to do his best to prevent people from coming up. But he's one person and there's a large mass of people moving towards him. So he, retreats back up to the stairs where there's a larger number of officers, Capitol police officers inside the building. And at that point, once the group moves into this area where the police officers are and the police officers move in to meet the group, the officers are fully outnumbered, but the individual human beings that are there, that are not supposed to be there, are standing their ground and just standing there and refusing to leave. But they're not being violent, and they don't appear to be, what I heard in the audio was there's no violent things being discussed. It was just they decided they were going to place themselves in that Capitol building. And then the police officers at that point cannot respond with force because they are vastly outnumbered in an interior position. So like strategically that becomes, I guess what I'm saying is like, there's so much going on and there's so much chaos, which is the word we used at the very top of this episode, that what we're doing is giving you, everybody listening, all the varying pieces of the groups that may be involved. And it's so varying. We're just going to give you everything that we have seen.
Yeah. And to be clear, I'm in absolute agreement on that. I don't want to seem as though I am somehow not. One thing I think you guys would find of interest is that there was a stated calculus to this, because in the world of PR, they would call some things optics, right? There's some things that look like really bad optics where you see the police, clearly allowing people entry into, let's call it an outer perimeter of the Capitol. So later statements said that I appreciate the use of the word strategic, the strategic plan there, or the strategy there, I should say, is that given that these forces are vastly outnumbered, they wanted to create a smaller perimeter that they could defend feasibly. You know what I mean? Because otherwise, if there's just a line that's 2 or 3 officers deep, then it could easily get overrun and it could easily get escalated into a very violent situation. So that is the stated logic. And I love that you're bringing up the fact that not all of the officers appeared to be on the same page. That's very, very important. You know what I mean? It's not like all of the law enforcement in DC said, hey, let's leave this open. Let's tear down these barricades and stuff. You can see documented on LiveLeak, on other platforms, you can see people who are clearly just trying their best to maintain some sort of order and to de-escalate things, even though they are woefully, woefully outnumbered. You can also see, I've said several times here that this is premeditated. You can also see details in these images that I think strongly indicate there was premeditation, again, in factions of this force. One of the things would be the T-shirts. You could see these T-shirts bearing slogans with things like Auschwitz camp, which is a reference to genocide in World War II and clearly anti-Semitic in nature. You can also see T-shirts saying things like Civil War, January 6th, 2021. Now, I don't have a doctorate in T-shirts, but I'm pretty sure those were printed in advance. What do you think?
It feels like that's pretty plausible. What's the Auschwitz camp referencing? Like, I understand what it's referencing, like, historically, but in this situation, what's it referencing?
That's a good question, Noel. I think without having read an interview with the person wearing that T-shirt, I'm pretty sure that it was meant to be an anti-Semitic message,
or possibly a QAnon, like big picture, like Big Brother conspiracy kind of reference, as if like this administration, this new administration coming in represents, Democrats eating babies and, rounding people up into camps or something. Maybe I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, maybe it's possible that there is perhaps some reference we don't get, but I would argue that kind of phrasing is inseparable from anti-Semitism.
Oh, 1,000,000%.
And you could see other reports of other T-shirts, other paraphernalia, of course. And the building itself the interior, I believe, was secured in the early evening, but crowds remained outside into the night. And there was this thing happening, I believe it was first part of this episode, we talked about the use of language, both in media and in politics. And let me know if you guys noticed this. Matt, Noel, I know we were all watching this. Did you notice that a lot of the anchors seemed to be waxing a little bit poetic when they were talking about the curfew? They were like, the curfew's at 6 p.m. The sun is already setting on Washington and the country, or like the light is falling on the Capitol.
The friscolating dusk light.
Everything has been feeling like a scripted reality show lately, and it's just all part of it, guys.
That's very good foreshadowing, right?
Or the simulation, perhaps.
And at this point, let's pause for just a moment. We'll be back after a word from our sponsor to look at some of the immediate aftermath of the events in Washington, D.C.
right, and we are back.
So in probably what felt like the beginning of the restoring of order, we did see a larger police force move in and clear the perimeter, clear the steps. By the time it was nighttime, there's a lot of concern that this wouldn't happen by nighttime, and then all bets are off, because it's a lot harder to round people up under cover of darkness. It did seem that was effectively done. A lot of those tactics of, creating a perimeter of human bodies with shields and pushing people back, that was done. And the facility was secured in so much as they felt comfortable reconvening Congress, who began the continuation of the work they had started earlier in the night. And by this point, all of these folks had been, in hiding in various rooms. I heard a lot of them talking on a lot of news shows, calling in, everyone asking them, are you okay? We don't want to give away your location, but are you okay? And I heard one particular, I wish I remembered the gentleman's name, but it was a Republican, and he was talking about how he was sort of holed up with a lot of folks from both sides of the aisle, literally kind of hiding together, and that conversations were happening and that texts were being exchanged. And there were a lot of people kind of changing their perspective on this protest that they were about to do, or this ceremonial, objection to the election results. So that does begin the process that was interrupted so suddenly and shockingly earlier in the day.
Yeah. For the first time in possibly a while, a lot of people were watching C-SPAN, which is a tiny point, but that's something that hit me. Congress does reconvene. And they state they're going to be working into the night to certify the election. Some prominent members of Congress, from the House to the Senate, make opening statements. You know what I mean? You'll see Mitch McConnell making statements, Nancy Pelosi, Schumer, the list goes on, and they begin the process, or they're back into the process. During this statement and during this time that you just mentioned, Noel, you're right. Multiple members of the House and about half of those Senate members who had planned to object withdraw their intent to object. In fact, Senator Kelly Loffler from Georgia, this was a senator who was appointed and recently lost the runoff election. Senator Kelly Loffler takes the floor and says, given these events, I will no longer support opposition to this electoral college process. So she's essentially saying at this point, when it comes time to certify stuff for Georgia, she's not going to raise a flag and attempt to trigger, a debate on the legitimacy of those conclusions. And so things wind on and on and on and on. Congress works until, or they do this process until 3:39 a.m., I think it was, Eastern Time, when the current Vice President, Pence, finalizes the Electoral College vote tally and declares that the Biden-Harris ticket, that they are the winners of the election by a vote of 306 to 232. Before this happens, before we hit 3:40 in the morning, another thing happens. Current President Donald Trump is banned from Twitter, or he's suspended, right, for a very specific amount of time, for 12 hours.
And for the first time, I believe, has actually had tweets removed.
I believe that's correct. Instead, now, previously, some had been marked as unconfirmed or even misleading.
Fact check kind of little addendums that Twitter was doing as a way of confronting the allegations that they were contributing to this spread of misinformation.
Right. Just so. And so one thing that was interesting to this, and I think would be interesting to our fellow conspiracy realists in the crowd here, is that Edward Snowden came out, and this was actually on January 7th. He said, Facebook officially silences the President of the United States. For better or worse, this will be remembered as a turning point in the battle for control over digital speech. And a lot of people gave him some flack about that. You know what I mean? Not everybody agreed.
And this all goes back to that power of language. And that power of like, what is free speech? When does it cross the line from just expressing one's views to inciting others to act? And does the weight of a president's words make a difference? And I think the answer is yes to that. But I'm interested in your thoughts, Matt, on the language here, and if this is censorship or if this is just doing the right thing.
Well, I don't have the answer for you if it was the right thing, but I do know that the president's responses to the actions that were taking place did not calm things down, and it doesn't seem, at least, like they were meant to calm things down. It seems like they were meant to, I don't know, to get whatever aide or advisor was telling him to, hey, calm this thing down. It was like to appease that person, is what it felt like to me. Doesn't mean that that's necessarily true.
Yeah.
And then that kind of response continued. And it was the response to his responses that got him indefinitely and temporarily banned from using the services. The language that was used in the responses did not seem to be calming. It seemed to continue to foment the anger that was being riled up there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because to Snowden's point there, what I'm understanding that as is a concern about setting a precedent, because we have to remember, even though these social media platforms and conglomerates, even though they are in bed with intelligence agencies to one degree or another, they are private entities, which means they retain the right to, for whatever reason they wish, to refuse service to anyone, anywhere, for any reason. This becomes concerning when it runs up against the notion of governmental agencies, right? Because what happens, like if we, Snowden said, think past the next 13 or so days, right? Post January 20th, what happens if now the precedent is, if Twitter doesn't like you for any reason, you're shut down. If Twitter suddenly gets in a tangle with the FBI because of some kind of, I'm making stuff up here, some kind of Twitter crime, and the FBI, is still on Twitter, then Twitter can just cut them off.
Mm-hmm. I think it's worth saying too, it's not against the law to lie. Right? Yeah. It's not against the law to spread misinformation. It's again about the intent or about the results. And that's why it's so tricky, because it's like, does he know he's lying?
Well, do you know what is against the law, though?
Inciting a riot.
Yes. And that's essentially what was happening, whether the president understood it or not. And Twitter understood it. And Facebook understood it. But I totally see what Edward Snowden is saying. He's saying that from the perspective of a whistleblower. Imagine if someone who knows the truth about some terrible thing or some group or, whatever, and is trying to get that information out however they can, and they are silenced. That is, I'm sure, from where it is, that statement is coming from.
Yeah. I've heard it phrased as Congress abdicating power to tech companies, which is an interesting way to look at it. We do want to say, though, that after President Trump was suspended from Twitter, there was another statement released. And this statement doubled down on the claim that the election was rigged, specifically stolen from him. And then it also had the following: a confirmation that there will be, quote, an orderly transition on January 20th. We alluded to this in part one. This is the closest, at the time of this recording, this is the closest the current president has come to conceding the election. And also important to note, it is not the same thing as actually conceding. It's saying, I didn't lose, this is rigged, but there will be a peaceful transition on January 20th. What did you guys make of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the best we're going to get. This is a man who is, I think, pathologically just predisposed to not accepting defeat. I mean, if you read his biographies about him and his relationship with his father, like he was basically born and bred and had this notion hammered into his head that the worst thing in the world to be is a loser, and he's acted that way for his entire life and for his entire presidency.
In the end, the dangerous thing for me is that it's the same response. It's I am conceding to the notion of the people who need me to say these things, but also I didn't lose. And that he's speaking to people who, who care about him and his message and are willing to take action for him on his behalf.
Further action, potentially.
Excellent point. Let me read the entirety of the statement for anybody who hasn't heard it yet. It is this. Even though I totally disagree with the outcome of the election, and the facts bear me out, nevertheless, there will be an orderly transition on January 20th. I have always said we would continue our fight to ensure that only legal votes were counted. While this represents the end of the greatest first term in presidential history, it's only the beginning of our fight to make America great again.
So, only the beginning of our fight, man.
Right. So does that sound like, Matt, you said something that really stuck out to me when you were like, it's not the same thing. I remember that like in the great gallery of non-apologies, it's like, what's the main, like, oh, I'm sorry you feel like you deserve an apology.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sorry you feel that way, or I'm sorry.
Yeah, there it is.
Feel like I hurt you.
Or I'm sorry if it came off as though I were doing this. That's a little better, but it's still not great.
It's not, I mean, yeah. So that's why I say it's not actually the same thing as a concession. It's just saying there will be an orderly transition.
Yeah, but the scary thing is that it doesn't matter now if he is committing to an orderly transition, if all of his team members are committing to that transition, if it even begins that way and starts going down that way. He has spoken then in that same statement to those people that are willing to take action to try and stop it from happening or to try and save him or protect it. It's really disheartening and it's scary, to be honest, because it doesn't matter if he knows that's what he's done or not. That's what he's done.
Now, within the hour while we've been recording this, I was actually just Googling what C-SPAN stands for because I've never really known. But while I was Googling that, I found within the last hour, there was a statement from Kayleigh McEnany,
right?
Not from Trump himself. She came out, took no questions, and basically parroted back the condemnation type talk that a lot of lawmakers have been coming out with. This is un-American. This is abhorrent. We condemn this. And then referenced the burning of a church. Remember that church? That was like the one example of arson in the summer that they keep pointing to. And I'm not saying that wasn't a non-issue because it obviously was, but I feel like it was a little bit overblown the way they describe it as though the church was in flames. It was like a small, easily contained fire, like in the basement or something like that, if I'm not mistaken, but don't let me speak out of turn there. But referenced that and said a year ago or whatever ago, I stood in this podium and condemned that and said that wasn't America, and I do the same thing today. But then, God, talk about a susser, like when she walks away, just the general sound of like dissatisfaction. Where's the president? Is the call that kept coming. Like, why are you here? Which I think is a fair question.
Insider reports are troubling. You know, we're at the stage in the news cycle as we record this when we hear things that inevitably come from like an anonymous source close to events, or an anonymous source close to the White House, an anonymous source positioned with the Secret Service, right? And that's because many of these people are in a rock and a hard place, very high stakes. That's part of the reason why we're seeing so many resignations from the cabinet. As of now, as we've been recording this, there have not actually been that many arrests, considering how many people were involved and how many people are easily identified. The FBI has put out requests for assistance identifying people, and internet users have been more than happy, right, to attempt to assist with that. Many of them, however, are not trained investigators.
Not to mention so many of these, frankly, entitled folks kind of narking on themselves, thinking they were justified. And now like there was one guy from Ohio, whose name escapes me at the moment, but he, posted a selfie video going in, his face fully revealed, using a personal account with his information and his name. And now he's being doxxed, not doxxed, but just look up his LinkedIn. People know who he is. He's probably going to lose his job. There was a newly elected lawmaker from, I want to say West Virginia, who also posted a selfie video going in with the big surge, he said his name out loud. Now he's being called to resign. So people are narking on themselves on this because there was a certain sense of entitlement that was staggering to me. Like we're justified. We can hold up our phone. This is a big moment for us, as opposed to we know we're doing something bad. I don't think a lot of these folks knew they were doing something bad.
And the OPSEC is just sloppy. I mean, there's one guy who is wearing his work badge clearly displayed. Don't act surprised when you lose your job for that. Again, we're recording this a few days before it comes out. So we just want to put up a signpost. Some of the stuff we're talking about now, some of the questions we will pose may well be answered by the time this episode comes out. But as you could tell, hopefully we're doing our best to be up to the minute with the information that we have. Right now, members of Congress have drawn up articles of impeachment. Just for, if there's the quick question about this that comes up sometimes is there a limit on impeachments, right? Is an impeachment like a one-time thing? The answer is no. Technically, people can be impeached multiple times. Is it unusual for someone to draw up articles of impeachment for someone who is 2 weeks away from leaving their post? I would say yes. I would say that's unusual, but these are extraordinary circumstances. The big speculative one is the 25th Amendment, which we covered in a previous episode.
Well, and we talked about the power that Mike Pence did not have to just overturn election results unequivocally. This is a place where the vice president does have a pretty significant role in invoking this.
This just in, we've got a up to the second update from our good old mission control here. It appears that Vice President Pence has publicly stated that he does not plan to invoke the 25th Amendment. When we're talking about the 25th Amendment, by the way, we're talking specifically about what's known as Section 4. Section 4 is unique in the 25th Amendment because it allows for the non-consensual removal of a standing president. Section 4 has never been used in the history of the United States.
And it has to do with the acknowledgement of their inability to discharge their civic duty. And I believe the VP invokes it, and then it has to be voted on.
Right. Yeah. So it's since we've never seen it in use before in practice, we don't really have a precedent or an understanding for how it would work in this country. Even the language of the group that has to support this, that has to kind of vote for it and take it to Congress, even that's a little bit fuzzy. It does have to be the vice president. It could be the majority of the cabinet as well, or it can be like a group approved by law by the Congress. I don't know how far the latitude goes there, but we know that regardless of what other members are involved or what groups they're from, it does count on the VP. It hinges on the VP's decision to invoke. And according to that latest report, the VP has no plans to invoke.
Even though the president may not be leaving the office via the vice president in the 25th Amendment, there are several positions, individuals within the administration who have already decided to leave, to resign. We're recording this, like we said, on Thursday, the 7th of January, 2021. So over the weekend, there might be more resignations or other things like that will happen. But as of right now, there are just a few. And, you have to think, even though the New York Times or someone from the New York Times is reporting that the 25th Amendment won't be invoked by the VP, it doesn't mean that something might change. At least right now, it's not happening. And we just have to imagine that some of the people leaving, it's because they disagree with what's going on. They can't handle that. Some of them may not want to be a part of whatever process would need to take place to impeach the sitting president.
Yeah, that's an excellent I think that's an excellent observation. The first one that we know about is Elaine Chao, who resigned in the wake of the riot or the insurrection, was serving as Secretary of Transportation. We should also mention, by the way, that Chao is the spouse of Mitch McConnell himself, and Mitch McConnell, in that statement when Congress reconvened, took a strident stance against the current president, Donald Trump, who is also, they're of the same political party, ostensibly. Though those parties may well split, we may be looking at the germination, the genesis of something different in the near future. At this point, we need to make space to talk about some of the conspiracy theories, speculation that have proliferated like wildfire in the wake of these events. And we'll do that after a word from our sponsor. And we're back. One of the conspiracy theories that proliferated and thrived immediately after this, not even immediately after, during the events on January 6th, was the idea that these people overrunning the Capitol were not actually Trump supporters, that they were not actually people who had attended the rally, or they were not supporters of the current president who had planned to overrun the Capitol, that they were instead agent provocateurs of a sort, that they were, we'll say it, that they were Antifa, and that they had planned and disguised themselves as part of an orchestrated attempt to discredit the claims of the Trump administration that the election was fraudulent. In each alleged case that we have seen so far, again, some new information might emerge. In each alleged case that we've seen so far, the claims have been disproven. Like, there have been people who are identified as being both at one of the protests over 2020 and then being at the rally or the Capitol on January 6th. But in each of those cases where those people have been identified, it turns out that they are, in fact, supporters of the administration, or they are affiliated with one of those associated groups, like we named earlier, Proud Boys, QAnon, Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, and so on.
This is a really familiar argument, though, right? Didn't we see the same kind of thing thrown around with the BLM protests and, all the around George Floyd, that there were agent provocateurs? We did a whole episode on agent provocateurs that was largely around that event.
I think we have to just at least say that maybe that was a part of it, but we currently can't prove it.
Yeah. That's why we've got to be careful to say, like, again, in the claims that we have seen, the ones that point to a specific person, those have been disproven. Unless that person is like a sleeper agent for years and years level of Antifa or anti-fascism. And this also leads into the idea of the entire thing being orchestrated, right? Because there are many people who would argue that the establishment Democratic Party, the establishment Republican Party are fingers on a hand. And I do have to say, in certain instances, there is clear collusion between those parties, and they have been much less antagonistic toward one another in back rooms than they have been in the public sphere.
Well, we talk about that a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. But in this case, we just haven't seen proof yet. If there is proof, of course, we would want to see it. There's another thing here. The notes for this show are so crazy because it says just like we have 3 different sections called the aftermath. Did you notice that?
The aftermath and the pre-aftermath.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about a larger horizon. In these situations, it is so difficult to look beyond the next moment, the next hour, the next announcement. We have this, I would say, to a degree, necessary myopia that comes into play. But if we look beyond the horizon, similar to what Snowden was referring to. This may well be just the beginning of other similar events. Oh, did we mention this? I think we did. Yeah, we did mention this. Multiple other states, capitals, and multiple other states, capitals with an A, experienced similar events, including Georgia. So Mayor Bowser of D.C. declared a public emergency in addition to that curfew, and that extends up to January 20th, the date of the inauguration. And I believe the inauguration itself is going to be virtual due to COVID. Is that correct?
I mean, I imagine that it'll be ceremonial and it'll take place on the grounds as it normally would, but it won't be. They'll keep up. They sure as hell, if they weren't before, they're going to now keep a tight perimeter on that Capitol building. Yeah,
it's true. And we can only imagine that even as a virtual event, security will be much higher than it was in the Capitol. Regardless of how you voted in the U.S. or how you feel about protests, which longtime listeners, we strongly support the right, at times the responsibility to protest. There's no denying this was to a degree planned. And while, to our earlier points, not all members of this group these groups may have showed up planning to do this, to overrun the Capitol, many did. This was planned, not just in D.C., but in multiple other places. What were the motivations of this group? In many cases, those involved do seem to genuinely believe the outcome of the presidential election is incorrect. But there's something interesting, and I know we've all seen it. A lot of the elected officials who held this position before January 6th, whether or not they recanted their opposition, they were objecting to the same ballots that got them elected. So they were saying this thing is rigged. I mean, not my part. Just the part I don't agree with.
It's just the kind of stuff, the sort of doublespeak that really does make your head spin, where it's like, yeah, I agree with this until the moment that it goes against me. And all of these notions, like if you hear that call with Raffensperger, Trump's talking about these voting machines and really drilling down into we're the Dominion people coming in and removing parts from the machines and installing new parts. And they're just like, no. He's like, are you sure? And they're like, yes. So, I mean, it just so much of this stuff. There was a whole thing where there was a video of something happened where some things were under a table or a skirt around a table and they were referred to as being suitcases. And he's referring to shredding of ballots and all this stuff, all things that Raffensperger and the, election officials here in Georgia were able to disprove very cleanly. And yet it just keeps coming up. You just keep repeating it and repeating it and repeating it. And people just eventually kind of just believe the repetition rather than because the allegations are sexier than the disproving of the allegations in some degree. Especially if it supports,
almost always.
Yeah, but especially if it supports your thing, your belief. And I don't think it's a matter of people being stupid. I just think belief is a powerful thing, and Trump is really good at inspiring loyalty. And when you repeat things over and over and over again, people react. And it's not about intellect. I know some very smart people that have fallen down that rabbit hole for other things.
Yeah. Speaking of, this date, January 6th, is not something that just popped up out of nowhere. We talked about it earlier in the first episode a little bit. We talked about it in this episode a little bit. It was telegraphed by a lot of people on different forums. There were QAnon supporters that discussed the date. Trump himself tweeted that this is a date to remember, January 6th. And there were, Proud Boys too, for sure. And we talked about the t-shirts that were printed out, right? We know that it takes time to print t-shirts en masse. It's not like they were just made all of a sudden. And, you take the internet forums and you will see people discussing this date and where they're going to be and how they're going to make this happen. And you can argue that that's for the Save America rally that was planned, right? That was a thing that was going to take place. And maybe they were just going to go check out the rally itself. But if you look deeper into those forums and what's being discussed, you'll see that there's probably some intention here, at least on the part of some individuals.
There's a really interesting, somebody that I want to read up more on, a historian from the University of Chicago that was making a lot of the press rounds yesterday. Her name is Kathleen Bellew, and she's an assistant professor of history at the University of Chicago, and she wrote a book called Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement in Paramilitary America. And she identified the following, from symbology, from hand signs, etc. She said, I think that we're looking at a broad array of people that include QAnon believers and conspiracy theorists, some parts of Trump's most devoted base. That's its own thing. And then some activists who have been organizing quite opportunistically towards the overthrow of the U.S. and its democratic institutions for decades. Opportunistically, aka not ideologically aligned with any of this, just using it as a springboard to achieve their ends. I think that is what you'd call an agent provocateur, right?
Yeah, I'm interested in the internal, like the citizens who have those views and are working internally to make that happen, but I'm way more interested in foreign powers that are seeing this as an opportunistic moment. But we can talk about that.
Yeah. So this was, to your point, Matt, this was telegraphed well in advance. There are multiple forums. There are multiple great reporting investigative outlets predicting this a long time ago and just zeroing in increasingly on the specifics of the event. And those forum plans do include explicit stated goals of, attacking the press and things like that. And therefore, I would argue any claim of surprise on the part of law enforcement or politicians remains suspect. It's sus, as you would say in the game Among Us. There are only a few possibilities for not knowing something like this was brewing. They are an egregious level of incompetence or willful ignorance, a head in the sand kind of vibe. There's a third possibility, a quiet part, not a ton of mainstream outlets are saying aloud, collusion. So check out our earlier episode on extremist infiltration in the military and in law enforcement, candidly. Also, President-elect Joe Biden came out today as we were recording this and pointed out explicitly, he said, look, there's no way around it. Everybody knows that Black Lives Matter protesters were treated differently than the folks in D.C. yesterday. I'm paraphrasing here, but you can find his speech in full. Law enforcement did signal this to far-right groups, to folks who were opportunistically piggybacking on this stuff. And I'll get to the thing about foreign powers, too, because I agree, Matt, that's crucial. Law enforcement was every time there was a radically, different response to far left versus far right protesters, that was taken as a signal, right? That was taken as the idea that was taken as saying, we will not come down on you as hard nor as definitively as we've come down on other groups. So you've heard it before if you've listened to this show for a while. I've often maintained we teach people how to treat us. While that sounds like a cliche, a truism, a figure of speech, it is all three of those things. It rings absolutely true here. And this is that sentiment on a macrocosmic level. Authorities and law enforcement, whether through negligence or whether through design. Now, I don't think this was a unified thing, just to be clear. Factions, let's say, of law enforcement, whether through negligence or through design, have taught certain genres of extremists that they are literally able to storm the seat of American government with little to no risk of injury, and at this point, little to no risk of serious repercussions. Now, again, that may change. I imagine the reaction, or I hope the reaction from the federal level is to come down hard in this, in this regard, because I would expect people should get in trouble if they're out stealing podiums from Congress. I don't know. I'm not the guy in charge of podiums. I'm just guessing.
Well, that's certainly been the call from lawmakers from both sides of the aisle, is prosecute these, people to the greatest extent of the law. But, there's a lot of bluster involved in politics. It's almost as though they don't always tell the truth. But yeah, it's certainly something that's been said. It was said in that statement from Trump's camp. So we'll see. Because the info sure is out there. Because they weren't trying to hide themselves or their identities one iota.
I mean, remember the FBI found one protester last year via Etsy, of all things. You guys remember that?
I think I don't.
But this is, Matt, the point you raised, I don't want to lose it because it is so crucial. This is a gold mine for foreign countries and non-state actors that are antagonistic to the U.S. Aside from being an international embarrassment of the highest order, it weakens the U.S. position in the world during a very turbulent time. China is becoming increasingly authoritarian. The doomsday clock of the Middle East powder keg is just it's just hovering, a few milliseconds, a few figurative milliseconds, I should say, before midnight. So how bad can this get? Military allies abroad, we were talking about this off air, military allies abroad have come forward and they have said, not us, not us as in this show, not us as in the U.S. government, military allies in other countries that we work with have gone on record saying they believe the current president deliberately conspired to incite a coup. And they took it a step further, folks. They said this plan may have occurred with assistance from federal level law enforcement officials. I don't know. What do you think about that? Those are heavy, heavy words.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm with it. And I just wanted to end, for my part, end with a quote from a tweet from that Kathleen Bellew, who I just mentioned. She said, getting lots of notes. So for those who need to hear this, it feels this bad because it wasn't a protest. The sadness and rage comes from seeing a terrorist attack. Only by sheer luck was it not a bombing. And we know that it could have been because there were bombs. And there's ample reason to think we could have seen assassinations.
Yeah, and it stinks, but we may still, and that's why this is so freaky, because it hasn't stopped, and there it's like lighting a fuse, and there's no real way to turn it off. It's made out of that special substance where it's very difficult to stop that fuse from continuing to burn.
Sorcerer's Apprentice.
Yeah,
and just have to say it.
No, yeah, Sorcerer's Apprentice for sure. Those buckets just are going to keep going. But I guess what I mean is, if there are foreign intelligence agencies that are looking in and saying, "Wow, yeah, this is serious." If there's actionable intelligence, I implore you, everyone out there in MI5 or 6 or 7 or whoever you are, wherever you are, let us know, or send some stuff to Snowden. Let him let us know. Because it definitely feels weird to me. Like, we've been doing this show for long enough. We've been looking at some of these weird things for long enough that it feels as though the actions that were taken could have been, even without the sitting president's knowledge, used against the United States by some foreign intelligence group or, military that's planning to cause harm to the United States on purpose. It felt that way.
Yeah, I mean, consider also the massive opportunity to breach security in a way that hasn't existed before. What if, and we're just speculating here, what if you are a foreign intelligence operative on the ground at these protests? You say, oh, we're getting into the Capitol. We're getting into the offices of Congress. They
I've got these handful of bugs.
Mm-hmm. Their emails are open. They're still logged in. You know what I mean? Like, I can look at the screen. I could send an email as this congressperson right now. Maybe I'll just
install malware.
Right, install malware. That's probably more realistic than what I was going to say. Like, maybe they're just going to send an email to their keeper and go, lol. But I mean, it's true. It's a massive security leak. There was a guy who got out of, because these people weren't really getting searched when they were getting removed. So there's a photograph of somebody with a piece of congressional mail and just took it with them, right? This is the guy who was
Wasn't it Pelosi's mail?
It was.
It was. Yeah. That's correct. There's also a note left in that congressperson's desk that says, "We will not back down."
Surprised nobody took a dump in her drawer or something like that.
There's speculation that someone urinated.
Okay.
Yeah. There's also speculation, increasingly focused speculation, that this is the first volley of something bigger, right? Like what happened, I saw some, again, I don't know how much credence to give these, but I saw statements where someone's like, we're coming back January 19th. We have learned that we can do this. Regardless of what you think about that, it's true. Some of the forces involved with attacking the Capitol are going to see this as a victory. You know what I mean? They're not going to see it as like, we got defeated, because they breached the Capitol. And now, again, we don't have all the answers. We want to hear from you folks. There's one huge question on everyone's mind in the United States and across the planet right now. And it's this: what happens next?
Next, you go to Twitter, find us where we're Conspiracy Stuff, or Facebook, also Conspiracy Stuff, or Conspiracy Stuff Show on Instagram, and tell us, send us things. We're interested. We want to continue. We will continue looking into this. So we look forward to anything and everything you want to discuss. Just find us on social media. And if you don't want to do that, we have a phone number.
That's right. You can call us at 1-833-STDWYTK. Take your 3 minutes. You get 3 minutes to say whatever you want to say. Let us know your name, or if you want to be anonymous, or if you just want us to call you by your first name. Make sure you let us know if it's okay to use your story on air. I would think you could just leave it for us. That's fine too. But if you are cool with it, you might end up hearing yourself on one of our weekly listener mail episodes. And if the stars truly align, you might get a personal call from Mr. Matt Frederick.
Yeah, beware.
Beware indeed. If you don't want to do any of that, but you still want to get in touch and you want to do it sort of a more old-fashioned way, why not just send us a good old email? We are
conspiracy@iheartradio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.